California, a land of golden beaches, redwood forests, and dreams forged under the Hollywood lights. But beneath the glamour, sunshine, and surf lies something far darker. Something that whispers through the foggy coastlines, howls in the desert, and lingers in old ghost towns. These are the 15 most haunted places in California, and if you listen closely, you might just hear the voices of the dead. The Watcher in White, the Queen Mary, sat like a sleeping leviathan in Long Beach Harbor, her once gleaming hull now weathered by decades of salt and stories. Sarah had always been drawn to the supernatural, which made her decision to stay at the legendary Shipturn Hotel both inevitable and foolhardy. She'd read the stories, seen the documentaries, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited in room B340. The check-in process was uneventful. The hotel staff, polite but distant, handed her the key without meeting her eyes. When she asked about room B340's reputation, the desk clerk's smile tightened. "Just an old room with old problems," he said dismissively, but his fingers lingered on the brass key as if reluctant to part with it. The narrow corridor leading to her cabin felt different from the ship's public areas. The carpet seemed older, the wallpaper more and an almost imperceptible chill hung in the air. Sarah's footsteps echoed strangely, as if the ship itself was listening. Room B340's door stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it properly. Inside, the room appeared ordinary enough, a small cabin with a single bed, a porthole offering views of the harbor, and vintage furniture that creaked under her weight. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, like being underwater. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to nerves and imagination. Night fell quickly over the harbor. Through her porthole, Sarah watched the city lights twinkle to life while ships' horns echoed across the water. She'd brought a book to keep her mind occupied, but found herself constantly looking up, sensing unseen eyes watching her every move. The feeling grew stronger as midnight approached. It was the sound of footsteps that first alerted her to the presence. Slow, deliberate steps in the corridor, outside her door, stopping directly in front of her room. Sarah held her breath, listening. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the hole. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps on her door, followed by silence. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The corridor was empty, but the overhead light flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Huh," she called softly, though she knew no one would answer. The knocking came again, this time from inside the room. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a hollow sound that made her teeth ache. Sarah backed away from the door, her eyes never leaving the wood grain. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to shake the entire cabin. Suddenly, it stopped. In the silence that followed, Sarah became aware of another presence in the room. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. At the foot of the bed stood a figure in white, a woman, tall and gaunt, her dress flowing as if caught in an underwater current. Her face was pale as moonlight, her dark hair hanging like seaweed around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that terrified Sarah most. They were completely black, like empty windows into nothingness, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stood there, watching. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but remain frozen in that bed. But she couldn't move. The woman's gaze held her in place, like invisible chains. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that room. The figure began to change. Her form became more translucent, her edges blurring like smoke and water. But those eyes remained, burning with an otherworldly intensity. Sarah felt herself being pulled into them, drowning in that endless darkness. As suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished. The room returned to normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a curtain being drawn back. Sarah found herself able to move again, her body trembling uncontrollably. She checked her phone. 3:33 a.m. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep and waking nightmares. Sarah dreamed of drowning in endless corridors, of faces pressed against porthole glass, of whispers in languages that predated human speech. When morning finally came, she fled the room without looking back. Later, researching the ship's history, Sarah discovered the truth about room B340. In 1962, a passenger named Elizabeth Ward had disappeared from that very cabin during a voyage to Hawaii. Her body was never found, though crew members reported hearing her voice calling for help from the ship's lower decks long after the voyage ended. Elizabeth had been traveling alone, returning to her family after a lengthy separation. Some said she was mad with grief over a lost child. Others claimed she was pursued by an obsessed suitor. Whatever the truth, she had vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and an empty cabin that seemed to remember her presence. The ship's crew had reported strange occurrences in room B340. 4 decades soon explained cold spots, phantom footsteps, and sightings of a woman in white standing at the foot of the bed. The room had been closed off for nearly 20 years before the hotel reopened it to guests, though many staff members still refused to go near it. Sarah's experience confirmed what others had reported. Elizabeth Ward hadn't left the ship when she disappeared. She had become part of it. Her spirit, trapped between the world of the living and the depths of the ocean. She watched from room B340, waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge her presence, to give her the attention she craved. The Queen Mary had carried thousands of passengers across the Atlantic, but none had left such a lasting impression as Elizabeth Ward. Her story had become part of the ship's legend. Sarah never stayed at the Queen Mary again, but she often found herself thinking about that night, about those black eyes watching from the foot of the bed. She wondered if Elizabeth was still there, still waiting, still watching. Some stories, she realized, never truly end. They simply continue, playing out again and again in the spaces between sleep and waking, in the narrow corridors of old ships that refused to forget. The Queen Mary remained in Long Beach, her dark reputation growing with each passing year. Room B340 continued to welcome guests, though many checked out early, claiming they couldn't sleep, couldn't stay, couldn't bear the feeling of being watched. And in the small hours of the morning, when the harbor was quiet and the city slept, Elizabeth Ward stood at the foot of the bed, watching, always watching, waiting for the next soul, brave enough to share her eternal vigil aboard the most haunted ship in California. The ship's horn echoed across the water, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the stories trapped within her steel hull. Among them, Elizabeth's voice joined the chorus of the restless dead, forever bound to the Queen Mary, forever watching from room B340. The phantom of Alcatraz. The fog rolled across San Francisco Bay like a shroud, swallowing Alcatraz Island in its ghostly embrace. Security guard Marcus Chun pulled his jacket tighter as he made his rounds through the abandoned prison, his flashlight cutting through the darkness with a pale beam. It was his 3rd week, working the night shift at the historic site, and he was beginning to understand why the older guards always looked so pale in the morning. The tour groups that visited during the day saw only stone and steel, a fascinating relic of America's penal past. But at night, when the island was empty except for the maintenance crew, Alcatraz revealed its true nature. Marcus had heard the stories, whispers from former guards, about screams echoing from cell block D, shadows that moved against the light, and the phantom sound of a banjo playing in the showers. He'd dismissed them as old man's tales until his first week on the job. It started with small things. The temperature would drop 20 degrees in certain corridors. For no explainable reason, doors would slam shut when there was no breeze. Marcus had walked into cell block D to investigate a sensor alert, only to find every cell door wide open, though he distinctly remembered locking them during his rounds. When he returned an hour later, they were all closed again. Tonight felt different. The air was thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to press against his ear. His radio crackled with static, and his flashlight flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. As he approached the shower area in the basement level, a faint melody drifted through the corridors, a haunting tune, played on what sounded like a banjo. Marcus froze. The music was unmistakable, a bluesy tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His hands trembled as he drew his flashlight toward the source. the beam revealing empty corridors, lined with rusted pipes and crumbling tile. The melody grew stronger, more distinct, and he could almost picture someone sitting in the showers, fingers dancing across old strings. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The music stopped abruptly, leaving behind an even more profound silence. Then came the screaming. It started as a low moan from deep within the walls, building to a crescendo of pure agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. Marcus pressed his back against the cold stone, his heart hammering against his ribs as the sound washed over him. It wasn't human. It was too deep, too resonant, like the island itself was crying out in pain. When the screaming finally stopped, footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Marcus's flashlight beam caught glimpses of movement, shadows that seemed to have substance, figures that flickered in and out of existence like old film footage. They moved with purpose, gliding rather than walking, their faces obscured by the darkness. One figure stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Marcus could feel its presence, like a physical weight. Though he couldn't see its face, he sensed malevolence radiating from it, a hatred so intense it made his skin crawl. The temperature plummeted, and his breath came out in visible puffs. Ice began forming on the walls around him. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows vanished. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Marcus found himself alone in the empty corridor, his flashlight steady and his radio clear. If not for the ice crystals still clinging to the walls, Hema had convinced himself it was all a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But Marcus knew better. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was a tomb for the souls who had died within its walls, trapped between worlds by the violence and despair that had defined their existence. The stories were true, and now he was part of them. As dawn approached and the first tour boats began their journey to the island, Marcus made his way to the exit. He would finish his shift, collect his paycheck, and never return. Some places were meant to be remembered from a distance, their secrets locked away like the dangerous criminals who had once inhabited their cells. But the spirits of Alcatraz would remain, forever playing their phantom music and screaming their eternal screams into the endless void of the bay. And perhaps, on foggy nights, when the moon was dark, other visitors would hear their calls and understand that some prisons never truly release their inmates, not even in death. The island stood silent once more, waiting patiently for the next soul brave enough to listen to its haunted symphony. The Whaley House, the salty breeze from San Diego Bay, carried with it whispers of the past. As Thomas Whaley first laid eyes on the vacant lot in 1857, the land seemed perfect for his family's new home, a stately Greek Revival mansion that would serve as both residence and courthouse for the growing frontier town. What Thomas did not know was that he was building his dream home directly atop the city's old gallows site, where criminals had met their end just years before. The Whaley family moved into their magnificent new home in 1880, a sprawling two-story structure with white columns and wide verandas that overlooked the bustling town below. The house was a marvel of its time, complete with a courtroom on the first floor, where Thomas conducted his business as a merchant and civic leader. For the first few years, life seemed idyllic for the Whaleys, filled with the laughter of their children and the warmth of family gatherings. But strange things began to happen almost immediately. It started with small disturbances, doors that would open on their own, objects that moved when no one was looking, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Thomas's wife Anna would often hear children playing in the hallways late at night, their giggles echoing through the empty corridors. When she would investigate, she would find nothing but silence and shadows. The disturbances escalated when their young daughter, Violet, began claiming she had a new friend in the house, a little girl about her age, who lived in the walls. Violet would talk to thin air, sharing her toys and secrets with someone the family couldn't see. The other children were unnerved by their sister's invisible companion, and Anna grew increasingly worried about Violet's mental state. Tragedy struck in 1862 when Violet fell ill with scarlet fever. Despite the family's desperate efforts to save her, The young girl succumbed to the disease and died in the very hallway where she had claimed to play with her ghostly friend. Her funeral was held in the family home, and she was buried in a small cemetery near the house. After Violet's death, the supernatural activity in the Whaley house intensified dramatically. Family members and visitors began reporting sightings of a spectral little girl wandering the hallways, her face streaked with tears as she searched for something or someone. The ghostly child would appear suddenly, her translucent form gliding silently through the rooms, only to vanish when approached. Thomas Whaley, a practical man of business, tried to dismiss these accounts as grief-induced hallucinations or overactive imaginations, but even he couldn't ignore the cold spots that seemed to follow him through his own home, or the disembodied footsteps that echoed through the halls when the house should have been silent. The courtroom, where he conducted his daily business, became particularly active with paranormal phenomena. Witnesses and jurors reported feeling an oppressive presence during trials, and some claimed to see shadowy figures watching from the gallery. The haunting wasn't limited to visual phenomena. Residents and visitors alike reported hearing unexplained sounds throughout the house, ghostly laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the rustling of unseen dresses, and the distinct sound of a woman sobbing in the nursery where Violet had spent her final days. These sounds were so consistent and realistic that even the most skeptical visitors found themselves checking doorways and corners, convinced they had heard something that couldn't possibly have a logical explanation. As decades passed, the Whaley House gained a reputation throughout San Diego as a place where the dead refused to rest. The family's troubles continued beyond Violet's death. Thomas's son, Thomas Jr., died suddenly of a heart attack while living in the house, and his body was laid out in the same hallway where his sister had died. The deja of tragedies seemed to strengthen whatever supernatural forces dwelled within the home's walls. By the early 1900s, the Whaley family had moved out, unable to endure the constant paranormal activity that had plagued their lives for over 50 years. The house changed hands multiple times, but no family could maintain residence for long. Tenants reported the same phenomena that had driven the Whaleys away: the crying child in the hallway, the cold spots, the move-like living things, and the oppressive feeling of being surrounded by unseen presences. Modern paranormal investigators have documented numerous unexplained phenomena at the Whaley House, including electronic voice phenomena, sudden temperature drops, and photographic evidence of apparitions. Visitors consistently report seeing the ghost of little Violet, her small form appearing in period clothing as she searches the hallways for her lost playmate. Some say her tears are still wet on her cheeks, her sorrow eternal and unending. The Whaley House stands today as a testament to the power of unresolved grief and the mysteries that linger beyond death. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's something undeniably unsettling about walking through those historic rooms, knowing that for over 150 years, the spirits of the departed have called this place home. The little girl still cries in the hallway, waiting for a friend who may never come. Her presence a reminder that some stories don't end with death. They simply continue in a realm between the living and the dead. The last starlet, the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, had seen its share of legends, but none quite like what happened to Sarah Chun that October evening, a struggling actress from Ohio. Sarah had finally scraped together enough money for a week at the famed Art Deco landmark, hoping that simply breathing the same air as Marilyn Monroe might spark her own star. Room 247 felt different the moment she entered. The vintage furnishings seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and an intoxicating scent of gardenias lingered. Despite the room's obvious age, Sarah attributed it to the hotel's storied past. After all, this was where Marilyn had lived, where countless dreams had been born and shattered against the harsh realities of tin. On her third night, Sarah awoke to the sound of whispering. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as the voices grew clearer, feminine, breathy, discussing something about the scene, and getting it right this time. The words seemed to echo from the walls themselves. When she switched on the bedside lamp, the room appeared normal, but the gardenia scent had intensified. Sarah shook her head, chalking it up to jet lag and an overactive imagination. Famous hotels were supposed to be haunted, weren't they? It was practically part of the experience. The next evening, while exploring the hotel's ornate corridors, Sarah noticed something peculiar in the mirror-lined hallway on the second floor. Her reflection walked beside her, but so did another figure. Tall, blonde, with that unmistakable silhouette that belonged in old movie magazines. Sarah spun around, but the hallway was empty except for her own panicked breathing. She called out, her voice echoing off the Art Deco walls. The whispering returned that night, more insistent now. Sarah pressed her ear to the door and heard what sounded like heels clicking on the marble floors below, followed by the distant tinkle of piano keys from the hotel bar. Unable to sleep, she decided to investigate. The lobby was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the checkerboard floor. As she descended the grand staircase, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, like someone was trying to tell her something important. In the hotel bar, she found the source of the piano music, but the player was unlike anyone she'd ever seen. A woman in a white dress sat at the grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced The melody was hauntingly beautiful, something from the golden age of Hollywood that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, not wanting to interrupt, but feeling drawn to the mysterious musician. The woman's head turned slowly, revealing features that made Sarah's breath catch. It was Marilyn Monroe, or at least someone who looked exactly like the screen legend. But there was a sadness in those famous blue eyes, a desperate quality that no camera had ever captured. "She needs your help," Marilyn said, her voice carrying that distinctive breathy quality. "The girl in the blue dress, she's forgotten why she came here." "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, though part of her wondered if she was dreaming. Marilyn's fingers continued playing, but the melody grew sadder, more urgent. "This place remembers everything. Every dream, every heartbreak, every promise made and broken. Some of us got lost in all that remembering." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Marilyn began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. The piano continued playing itself for a moment before the music died away entirely, leaving only the echo of what might have been a sigh. Sarah spent the rest of the night researching the hotel's history, discovering story after story of guests who'd seen Marilyn's ghost, heard her voice, felt her presence. But reading about it was different from experiencing it, from understanding that some people became so intertwined with a place that they could never truly leave. On her final morning, Sarah packed her bags, knowing she wouldn't be returning to Ohio. Something had shifted inside her during that ghostly encounter, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her Hollywood adventure. As she checked out, she caught her reflection in the lobby mirror, and for just a moment, she could swear she saw Marilyn standing beside her, smiling with approval. The Hollywood Roosevelt had claimed another dreamer, but this time, Sarah thought, she understood the real magic was you and Nadine becoming a star. It was in finding the courage to become exactly who you were meant to be. Some stories, after all, were worth staying for. The carpenter's curse. The hammering started at 3 a.m. Sarah Winchester pressed her palms against her temples as the rhythmic thud-thud-thud echoed through the mansion-esque labyrinthine corridors. 3 decades of sleepless nights had carved deep lines around her eyes, but she'd grown accustomed to the sounds that filled her endless home. Thud-thud-thud. She slipped from her 4-poster bed, wrapping a silk robe around her thin frame. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, and she followed the sound through the twisting hallway, past the staircase that climbed to a solid wall, past the door that opened onto nothing but empty air. The hammering grew louder. In the main hall, moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow fragments across the marble floor. There, on the second landing of the grand staircase, stood a figure in overalls and a faded work shirt. His back was to her as he methodically drove nails into the ornate banister. Sarah stopped breathing. The handyman, she could never remember his name, only that he'd been there when she'd purchased the property years ago, had died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack, they'd said. The funeral was yesterday, yet here he stood, hammer in hand, working with the same quiet efficiency that had annoyed her. "So during his lifetime, you're still here," she whispered. The hammering stopped. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both familiar and impossibly translucent. His eyes held the same weary expression she remembered from countless contractor meetings, when she'd demand another staircase to nowhere, or a door that led into solid brick. "Mrs. Winchester," he said, his voice like wind through empty rooms, "you never paid me for last month's work." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her pocketbook. "How much?" $2,000. She counted out the bills with shaking fingers, holding them out to the specter. He took them, and for a moment, his form seemed more solid. "Why do you keep building?" he asked, gesturing to the maze of corridors that sprawled around them. Room after room, staircase after staircase. None of it makes sense. Sarah looked around at her life-esque workhouse that had grown from a modest Victorian into a 17-story monument to guilt and fear. "The spirits," she said simply. "They won't let me stop." The handyman nodded, as if this explained everything. "They follow you everywhere, don't they? The ones who died from the rifles your family made." "Yes." Sarah's voice cracked. "Every night, I hear them whispering in the walls. They want more rooms, more hiding places. They say if I stop building, they'll take me too." "Did they kill me?" Sarah stared at him. "What? That heart attack. Was it natural, or did they have something to do with it?" The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. I don't know," Sarah whispered. The handyman looked around the impossible mansion with something like wonder. "Well, I suppose I'm not surprised. You've been building this place for nearly 4 decades, and it still feels unfinished, like it's hungry for more." "What do you want?" Sarah asked. "To help, of course." He smiled sadly. "I've been your handyman for 38 years. Why should death change that?" He turned back to his work, hammer rising and falling with supernatural precision. Sarah watched as he continued building the staircase that would climb to another meaningless attic, adding the decorative trim that would eventually be painted over. "Will you stay?" she asked. "As long as you need me." Sarah nodded and began the long walk back to her bedroom. Behind her, the hammering continued, a ghostly rhythm that would echo through the Winchester Mystery House for decades to come. In the morning, the new handyman would arrive, just as confused and overwhelmed as his predecessor had been, and Sarah would hire him, just as she had hired so many others, knowing that some things like guilt, like grief, like the weight of countless deaths could never truly be finished. The house would keep growing, room by impossible room, until the spirits were satisfied, or until Sarah herself joined the ranks of the restless dead who called this maze their home. Either way, the hammering would continue. Thud. The Cecil's shadow, the Cecil Hotel, squatted like a concrete monolith against the Los Angeles skyline, its weathered facade bearing witness to decades of darkness. Sarah had always been drawn to the macabre, and as a paranormal investigator, she couldn't resist the pull of the Cecil's notorious reputation. The hotel's history read like a grim ledger: countless suicides, mysterious deaths, and the infamous case of Eliza Lamb, whose final moments had been captured in that haunting elevator footage. Checking in at the front desk, Sarah noticed a clerk's nervous glances and the way he seemed to rush through the registration process. Room 1201, well floors up, just like Elisa's room. The coincidence sent a chill down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She was here for research, not superstition. The elevator ride up was uneventful, though Sarah made a mental note of the building's age and questionable maintenance. Room 1201 smelled of old carpet and something else, something metallic, that made her think of blood. She set up her equipment: EMF detectors, thermal cameras, audio recorders, and her trusted digital camera. Night fell over downtown Los Angeles, and the Cecil seemed to come alive with an energy that made Sarah's equipment spike erratically. The EMF detector buzzed constantly, and her thermal camera picked up unexplained temperature drops throughout the room. But it was around 2 a.m. when things truly began to escalate. The elevator outside her room started moving up and down, despite the late hour and the building's apparent emptiness. Sarah pressed her ear to the door and could hear the mechanical groaning, the cables straining. Her camera captured nothing unusual, but the viewfinder kept flickering, showing distorted images that vanished when she tried to photograph them directly. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on her door, followed by silence. Sarah's heart raced, but she reminded herself that hotels had maintenance workers, late guests, any number of logical explanations. Still, when she opened the door, the hallway stretched empty before her, the emergency lighting casting long shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Back in her room, Sarah reviewed her audio recordings. Between the static and white noise, she could hear something else whispering, too faint to make out words, but clearly human in origin. The thermal camera showed a cold spot near the window, a perfect silhouette of a person standing where no person stood. As dawn approached, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to look out the window. The city below looked small, insignificant, and the street far below seemed to call to her. She shook her head violently, forcing herself away from the glass. Something wasn't right. Her camera suddenly activated on its own, the flash going off repeatedly in the dim room. When she checked the photos later, most were overexposed blanks, but a few showed figures in the background, shadowy shapes that had been there when she took the pictures. One image, taken while she stood alone in the center of the room, clearly showed a figure standing behind her, close enough to touch. Sarah realized she was no longer alone in her investigation of the Cecil Hotel. Whatever force had claimed so many lives within its walls had found her. The hotel's dark energy seemed to feed on fear and curiosity, drawing people to their doom, just as it had drawn her here. As she packed her equipment with shaking hands, she understood why the Cecil's reputation was so well earned. Some stories were meant to remain mysteries, and some hotels were better left unvisited after dark. The Cecil Hotel had claimed another witness to its terrible legacy, and Sarah knew she would never speak of what she experienced there. Some truths were too dangerous to share, too real, to ignore, and too powerful to escape once encountered. The elevator waited below, moving endlessly up and down, carrying invisible passengers to floors that existed only in the space between life and death. The Glen Tavern in the old Victorian building loomed against the Santa Paula night sky, its weathered wooden facade hiding secrets that had accumulated like dust over nearly a century. The Glen Tavern Inn had seen many lives come and go through its doors, some seeking refuge, others chasing dreams that would never materialize. But for Sarah Chun, the inn's newest guest, what awaited her would be neither refuge nor dreams, but something far more sinister. Sarah had chosen the Glen Tavern almost by accident. Her rental car had broken down just outside Santa Paula, and with limited options and a tight budget, she booked the cheapest room available. The elderly desk clerk, Mr. Rodriguez, had given her a knowing look when she'd requested room 304. "Third floor," he'd said simply, sliding the key across the worn mahogany counter. "Stairs are just there. To your left." The climb had been tiring, her suitcase wheels clattering against each wooden step. Now, standing in the modest room with its antique furniture and faded wallpaper, Sarah tried to shake off an inexplicable feeling of unease. The room was clean enough, but something felt wrong. As if the very walls were listening. She'd barely finished unpacking when the stomping began. It started softly, almost imperceptibly, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Sarah paused, ear pressed to the ceiling, wondering if the guest above was wearing heavy boots. But the sound had a peculiar quality to it, deliberate yet restless, like someone pacing with purpose. The stomping grew louder, more insistent. Sarah glanced at her watch, 11:47 p.m. She moved to the window, hoping to spot the source of the noise in the courtyard below, but the inn's grounds were shrouded in darkness. When she turned back toward the room, her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood silhouetted in the corner, motionless and tall. Sarah's heart hammered as she reached for the lamp on the nightstand, her fingers fumbling with the switch. Light flooded the room, and the figure was gone, but not before she'd glimpsed the distinctive outline of a cowboy hat and the glint of spurs. "Just my imagination," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Just stressed from the drive. But sleep didn't come as every creak of the old building made her tense, every settling groan of the wood sending chills down her spine. Around 2 a.m., just as exhaustion was claiming her, she woke to the sensation of being watched. There, at the foot of her bed, stood the cowboy. He was exactly as she'd imagined him in her brief glimpse, tall and lean, dressed in period clothing that looked authentic rather than costume-like. His boots were scuffed leather, his jeans worn, his shirt buttoned to the collar. But it was his face that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. His left eye was swollen shut, a dark bruise spreading across his cheek. A thin line of blood trickled from a split lip, and worst of all, his remaining visible eye was completely hollow, no iris, no pupil, just an empty socket that seemed to drink in the light. The apparition didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her with that one terrible eye. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but her body had frozen in primal terror. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours that felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the cowboy was gone. The room felt different somehow, lighter. Though Sarah couldn't stop shaking, she spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, staring at the foot of the mattress where he'd stood. In the morning, Sarah fled to the front desk, demanding answers. Mr. Rodriguez's weathered face showed no surprise at her story. "The third floor has always been special," he admitted quietly. "Place has a history, you know. Back in the 20s, this was a speakeasy. A lot of rough characters came through. Some say a cowboy got into a fight with some of the local toughs. They beat him pretty bad, left him bleeding in the street. His spirit never did leave." Sarah's hands shook as she signed the checkout form. "What happened to him?" "Never found out who did it," Rodriguez replied, not meeting her eyes. "Some things are better left in the past, miss. Some stories don't need telling." As Sarah drove away from the Glen Tavern Inn, she caught sight of something in her rearview mirror, figure standing in the third-floor window, hat in hand, watching her departure. Even from a distance, she could see that he was smiling, and for the first time since her terrifying encounter, she felt something other than fear. It was almost like gratitude. The Glen Tavern Inn settled back into its quiet existence, keeping its secrets close, waiting for the next traveler, brave or foolish enough to spend a night on the third floor. Some stories, after all, needed to be told, even if only to remind the living that the past never truly dies. It just waits patiently in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between footsteps, in the shadows that linger a moment too long in empty rooms. The wind howled through the broken windows of what was once the Bodie Hotel, carrying with it the dust of decades and whispers of the dead. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter as she stepped out of her rental car, camera hanging from her neck, notebook clutched in her gloved hand. Another ghost town, another assignment for the travel magazine. She'd seen dozens like this: abandoned buildings, crumbling foundations, tourist traps selling overpriced souvenirs. But something felt different about Bodie. The town sat in a high desert valley, surrounded by stark hills that seemed to press in from all sides. No gift shops lined the main street, no tour buses idled in parking lots, just empty structures standing like broken teeth against the pale sky, their wooden frames bleached gray by time and weather. Sarah had read about the Bodie curse online, but dismissed it as local superstition, colorful stories invented to keep tourists from stealing artifacts. She began her walk down Main Street, documenting the decay with professional detachment. The assay office stood with its roof partially caved in, windows like empty. Next door, the Methodist church held its silence like a secret. Her camera clicked methodically, capturing the same images thousands of visitors had taken before her. That's when she noticed a rock in her pocket. She must have picked it up without thinking. Just a small piece of quartz, no bigger than her thumb. It had probably fallen from one of the hills surrounding the town. Sarah pulled it out and stared at it, feeling suddenly foolish. Of course she hadn't taken anything intentionally. She'd be more careful going forward. That was all. The first sign was her camera. The digital display flickered as she raised it to photograph the old schoolhouse. Lines of static crossed the screen, then went dark. She pressed buttons, checked the battery, tried again. Nothing. The camera that had worked perfectly that morning now sat lifeless in her hands. Sarah cursed under her breath and continued taking notes by hand, though her pen seemed to move slower across the page, as if writing through molasses. By afternoon, she felt genuinely ill. A headache had settled behind her eyes, pulsing with each heartbeat. Her stomach churned with nausea. It had no business being there. Sarah blamed the altitude, the dry air, anything except the small quartz rock still sitting in her jacket pocket. When she finally stopped to rest on the steps of the old jail, she noticed something else. Her shadow didn't match her movements. She stood still and watched the shadow shift, stretching toward the abandoned buildings like it was being pulled by invisible strings. When she moved her hand, the shadow lagged behind, then jerked forward, as if catching up. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In the distance, she could swear she saw other shadows moving between the building's taller ones, human-shaped, walking paths that hadn't been walked in over a century. The rational part of her mind insisted on logical explanations. Dehydration, exhaustion, the strange light playing tricks on her eyes, but rationality felt thin and boaty, like ice over deep water. As evening approached, Sarah made her way back to where she'd left her car. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky the color of old blood. She quickened her pace, eager to leave this place behind. But the streets seemed longer now, the buildings shifting positions when she wasn't looking directly at them. More shadows moved in her peripheral vision, figures in old-fashioned clothes, men with pickaxes and lanterns, women in long dresses who turned their faces away as she passed. Her car was exactly where she'd left it, but the keys wouldn't turn in the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then died with a mechanical wheeze. Sarah's hands shook as she tried again. The headache had intensified to a throbbing ache, and now she could hear something else, faint voices carried on the wind, speaking in accents from another era. Leaving so soon, Sarah spun around. An elderly man stood behind her car, wearing clothes from the 1800s woolen coat, boots worn smooth, a miner's cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered and kind, but his eyes held a depth of sadness that made her chest tighten. "I was just leaving," she stammered. The man nodded slowly. "You took something that doesn't belong to you." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her pocket, where the quartz rock sat like a guilty secret. "I didn't mean to. I know." His voice carried the weight of years, of disappointment, of unfinished business. "But some things can't be taken. Not really. They belong here. With us." The man gestured toward the town, and Sarah saw them now, dozens of figures emerging from the buildings, walking the streets as they had over a century ago. Miners heading to work, shopkeepers tending their stores, families going about lives that had ended but never quite stopped. They moved with purpose, trapped in the routines of their final days. "The gold isn't what we're protecting," the old man said, his form beginning to fade like morning mist. "It's the memory, the dream, what we built here, what we lost. You can take pictures, write stories, but don't take pieces of us away." Sarah pulled a rock from her pocket and placed it carefully on the hood of her car. Immediately, the headache began to fade. The voices grew distant. Her shadow snapped back into proper alignment with her body. The car started on the third try. As she drove away from Bodie, Sarah watched in her rearview mirror as the last light faded from the town. She understood now why no one sold souvenirs, why the cursed stories persisted. Some places demanded respect, asked visitors to take only memories and leave only footprints. In her notebook, she wrote her final entry. "Some histories are too sacred to disturb." The echoes of Preston Castle, the rusted gates of Preston Castle, loomed before Marcus like the jaws of some ancient beast, their iron bars twisted and weathered by decades of neglect. As a paranormal investigator, he'd seen his share of abandoned locations, but something about this Gothic fortress in Ione, California, felt different, strong in a way that made his skin crawl. Built in 1894 as a reform school for wayward boys, Preston Castle had operated for nearly a century before closing its doors in 1969. Stories that emerged from its walls were legion: systematic abuse, cruel punishments, an unspeakable suffering that left invisible scars on countless young lives. But it was the tale of Anna Corbin that drew Marcus here tonight. Anna had been a housekeeper at the school during the 1920s, a kind woman who took pity on the boys under her care. When she'd tried to protect them from the brutality of the headmaster and his staff, they'd beaten her to death in the basement boiler room. Her body wasn't discovered for 3 days. Marcus adjusted his equipment bag and pushed through the gates, which groaned ominously on their hinges. The castle's Gothic spires pierced the night sky like accusing fingers, their shadows stretching across the overgrown courtyard. Dead leaves crunched beneath his boots as he approached the main entrance, where broken windows stared out like empty ice. The front door hung ajar, and Marcus slipped inside, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. His footsteps echoed through the grand foyer, where a sweeping staircase led to the upper floors. Peeling wallpaper hung in tattered strips from the walls, and broken furniture lay scattered like the bones of long-dead giants. He began his investigation in the East Wing, setting up his recording equipment in what had once been the boys' dormitory. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. Then, just as he activated his digital recorder, a sound froze his blood. A child's cry echoed through the hallway, high-pitched and filled with terror. Marcus spun around, his light sweeping the darkness, but saw nothing. The cry came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps, growing fainter as they retreated down the corridor. His equipment confirmed what his ears had heard. Clear audio of a boy screaming. Despite the room being empty, Marcus pressed deeper into the castle, following the sounds toward the basement where Anna Corbin had met her fate. The stone staircase descended into blackness, and Marcus's light seemed to struggle against the malevolent atmosphere that grew stronger with each step. The boiler room door stood partially open, and from within came a faint bluish glow. As he approached, the temperature plummeted. His breath formed visible clouds in the air, and his equipment began malfunctioning. Then he saw a translucent figure in a gray uniform, her face bruised and bloodied, her eyes filled with centuries of rage and sorrow. Anna Corbin materialized before him, her form flickering like a dying light bulb. She pointed toward the far wall, where Marcus noticed something his flashlight had missed. Fresh scratches in the stone, as if someone had been clawing at the surface recently. But Anna wasn't interested in the wall. Her attention was focused on something behind Marcus. He turned to see shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, the sands of them, the spirits of boys who had suffered within these walls. Their faces bore the same expression of pain and injustice that marked Anna's ethereal features. The housekeeper's ghost began to speak, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "They thought they could bury the truth," she whispered. "But the walls remember. The stones remember. And I will not rest until justice is served." As if responding to her words, the entire basement filled with the sounds of phantom screams, boys crying out in pain, pleading for mercy, calling for help that never came. The temperature continued to drop, and Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a single ghost, but an entire chorus of tormented souls who had found their voice through Anna Corbin's restless spirit. The investigation that Marcus had approached as routine suddenly became something far more significant. He was no longer just documenting paranormal activity. He was bearing witness to a century of injustice that demanded to be acknowledged. As dawn approached, the phenomena began to fade. Anna's form grew translucent, and the phantom screams gradually subsided. But before she disappeared entirely, the housekeeper's spirit pressed something into Marcus's hand, a rusted key that had been hidden in a wall cavity behind the boiler. The key, as Marcus would later discover, unlocked a sealed room in the administration wing, where decades of records died. The abuse at Preston Castle had been hidden away. Anna Corbin, even in death, had been working to expose the truth about what happened in her beloved school. As Marcus left Preston Castle that morning, he carried with him not just evidence of paranormal activity, but the weight of responsibility. Some stories, he realized, demanded to be told not just for the sake of the dead, but for the living who needed to understand the darkness that humans were capable of inflicting upon one another. The echoes of Preston Castle would follow him forever. A reminder that some places never truly forget, and some spirits never stop fighting for justice. The Rispin Mansion, the salt-laden wind, carried whispers of the past, as Sarah parked her rental car along the rocky coastline of Capi. Before her stood the infamous Rispin Mansion, its once grand Victorian facade, now weathered and worn like an old photograph left too long in the sun. She'd heard the story's shadow figures patrolling upper floors, a woman in black watching from windows that faced the restless Pacific. As a paranormal investigator, Sarah had explored countless allegedly haunted locations, but something about this particular estate drew her with an almost magnetic pull. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon light seemed to avoid certain sections of the house, leaving them perpetually cloaked in shadow. Or maybe the unnatural silence that surrounded the property despite its proximity to the crashing waves below. The front gate creaked ominously as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty grounds like a warning. Vines had claimed much of the mansion's exterior, their tendrils snaking around broken shutters and cracked windows. Sarah pulled out her equipment bag, checking her EMF detector and digital recorder before approaching the imposing front door. The wood was warped and swollen, but yielded easily. When she turned the rusted handle, inside, the air was thick with a scent of decay and abandonment. Dust motes danced in the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows, creating an ethereal atmosphere that was both beautiful and unsettling. Sarah began her investigation on the ground floor, methodically working her way through the main rooms. Her EMF detector remained silent, and her thermal camera showed no unusual heat signatures. Perhaps the stories were just that, stories, embellished over years of local legend. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened, she decided to explore the upper floors. The grand staircase groaned under her weight, each step echoing through the empty halls like footsteps from another time. On the second-floor landing, she paused to catch her breath and review her equipment readings. That's when she saw it, a shadow figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the end of the hallway. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she raised her camera, but when she looked through the viewfinder, nothing was there. She blinked hard, attributing it to fatigue and the tricks her mind played in such an atmosphere. Continuing her exploration, she entered what appeared to be a master bedroom. The furnishings were covered in dusty sheets, giving the room an otherworldly appearance. As she set up her equipment near the large bay window overlooking the ocean, she felt a sudden drop in temperature. Her breath formed small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The EMF detector began chirping rapidly, its lights blinking frantically. Sarah spun around, camera ready, but saw nothing. Yet she could feel a presence, ancient and patient, watching her from somewhere in the room. Movement caught her peripheral vision, and she turned toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, from the outside, was a pale face, framed by long, dark hair. A woman in a tattered black veil stared directly at her with hollow, sorrowful eyes. Sarah's scream died in her throat as the apparition raised one skeletal hand and pressed it flat against the window. The glass began to frost over, despite the warm California evening, spreading outward from the point of contact, like cracks in ice. Backing away slowly, Sarah kept her eyes on the window until she reached the doorway. As she turned to flee, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. The local warning echoed in her mind. If you hear footsteps behind you, hear. Don't look back. But curiosity proved stronger than caution. Sarah glanced over her shoulder just as she reached the staircase. Behind her stood a woman in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by a veil that seemed to absorb light itself. The ghost-ridden sif, they could be called, eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity that burned themselves into Sarah's memory. Time seemed to slow as their gazes met, and Sarah felt something ancient and terrible reach toward her consciousness. The last thing she remembered was the ghost's mouth moving soundlessly, forming words she couldn't understand but somehow knew would haunt her forever. When the police found Sarah's equipment scattered throughout the mansion the next morning, She was nowhere to be found. The only clue to her whereabouts was her camera, its memory card containing a single photograph. A shadowy figure standing in the upstairs hallway, watching the empty space where she had once stood. The Rispin mansion continued to draw ghost hunters and thrill seekers, each hoping to solve the mystery of Sarah's disappearance, while avoiding the warnings etched into local legend. Some say that on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the sea, you can still hear her footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and if you're foolish enough to investigate, you might just catch a glimpse of her face pressed against the window, forever trapped between worlds, forever searching for something just beyond reach. The mansion stands as a testament to the thin veil between the living and the dead, where shadows walk and watchers wait patiently for the next soul brave or foolish enough to cross their threshold. The castle on the hill, the wrought iron gates of Pyrenees Castle, stood like sentinels against the California night, their ornate scrollwork casting jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. For decades, locals in Alhambra had whispered about the imposing stone fortress perched on the hill, its Gothic towers piercing the dark sky like accusing fingers. Once the playground of a notorious gangster, now it served as something far more sinister, a gateway between worlds. Johnny Stompanato had built his empire on fear and bloodshed in the 1940s, transforming the sprawling mansion into both fortress and palace. The castle's thick stone walls had witnessed countless crimes, from brutal interrogations in the dungeon-like basement to the silencing of those who knew too much. When Stompanato met his violent end in 1957, the property changed hands multiple times, each owner eventually fleeing in terror or financial ruin. Maria Santos had been the building's superintendent for 3 years, living in a small apartment on the ground floor with a teenage daughter, Sophia. She tried to ignore the stories, the screams that pierced the night, the phantom gunshots that echoed through the empty halls, the mysterious lights that flickered behind boarded windows. But ignoring the impossible became harder each day. It started with small things, doors that locked themselves, footsteps in corridors that led nowhere, the distinct smell of cigar smoke in rooms that had been sealed for decades. Sophia complained of shadowy figures watching her from the darkness, while Maria found her tools moved overnight and maintenance logs written in handwriting that wasn't hers. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. Maria was checking the boiler room in the basement when she heard a woman's scream so piercing it seemed to tear through the very stones of the foundation. She rushed upstairs, her heart hammering, and called the police. Officer Danny Chun arrived within minutes, his flashlight cutting through the fog that clung to the castle's walls. He'd heard the local legends, but dismissed them as typical urban myths, until he stepped inside. The air felt wrong, somehow thicker, heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. "Ma'am, I don't see anything unusual," he said, though his voice carried an uncertain edge. They walked through the main hall, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The scream had been unmistakably real, yet now the castle lay silent, except for the wind whistling through cracks in the ancient stonework. They climbed to the second floor, checking room after room. Most were locked, their doors sealed with heavy chains or boards nailed across the frames. But one door stood slightly ajar, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. Vintage furniture sat, covered in dust sheets, and on the nightstand sat an old photograph of Johnny Stompanato, with a beautiful woman whose eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. "Who's this?" Chun asked, picking up the photo. Maria's face went pale. "That's Gina Marcelli. She disappeared the same night Stompanato died. Some say she was his girlfriend. Others say she was an informant. The police never found her body." As if summoned by her name, a blood-curdling wail erupted from somewhere deep within the castle's bowels. Both Maria and Chun felt their blood turn to ice. This wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of rage, of a soul trapped between life and death for over 60 years. They followed the sound to a hidden door behind a tapestry, leading down a narrow staircase into the castle's deepest chamber. The air grew colder with each step, and Chun's flashlight began to flicker ominously. At the bottom of the stairs, they found evidence that made their stomachs churn, fresh scratches on the stone walls, as if someone had been clawing their way out for decades. The chamber itself was empty, except for a single item. A woman's red dress, perfectly preserved despite the years, lying in the center of the room like an offering to the darkness above. As Chun approached to examine it, the temperature plummeted, and both witnesses saw their breath form white clouds in the torchlit space. Then came the gunshots, 3 sharp cracks that reverberated through the stone corridors. Chun drew his weapon instinctively, sweeping his light across the chamber walls, but found nothing. No one. Just the empty dress and the lingering scent of gunpowder that shouldn't have existed. Back outside, as dawn broke over Alhambra, both Maria and Chun tried to rationalize what they'd experienced. Equipment malfunctions, mass hysteria, the power of suggestion, anything except the truth they both knew in their hearts. Some places become cursed, not by supernatural forces, but by the weight of human evil that saturates every brick and beam. Pyrenees Castle would continue to stand on its hill, watching over the city below with eyes that had seen too much. And in the dead of night, when the fog rolled in from the coast, the screams would echo once more through corridors, where the ghosts of mobsters and their victims walked forever between worlds, trapped in an eternal dance of violence and retribution that no amount of time could erase. The castle had claimed another witness to its dark legacy, and like all who came before, Maria and Chun would carry its secrets to their graves. The canyon's call, the morning mist, clung to the ridges of Turnbull Canyon like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip. Marcus Rivera pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped onto the narrow trail, his hiking boots crunching on the gravel path that wound deeper into the rugged wilderness. He'd heard the stories, of course everyone in Whittier had. The canyon's dark reputation preceded it like a shadow. But Marcus was a skeptic. Ghost stories were for campfires and late-night radio shows, not for serious journalists investigating urban legends. As a freelance writer researching local mysteries, Marcus had chosen Turnbull Canyon as his next subject. The reports were intriguing. Ghostly children, mysterious chanting, the acrid smell of sulfur on still air. Most compelling was the account from a hiker who claimed to have witnessed a hooded figure levitating before vanishing in the blink of an eye. Marcus intended to debunk these tales, to bring rational explanations to frightened imaginations. The trail descended steeply, cutting through dense chaparral and ancient oak trees. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and the morning sun filtered through leaves in dancing patterns of light and shadow. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly natural. Marcus checked his audio recorder, ensuring it captured every sound, every detail of his methodical investigation. 2 hours into his hike, Marcus noticed something unusual. The birds had stopped singing. An unnatural silence had settled over the canyon, broken only by his own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through dry grass. He paused, checking his compass and map. According to his calculations, he should have reached a scenic overlook by now, but the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. That's when he heard a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate from the canyon walls themselves. The words were indistinct, guttural, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. Marcus spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing except the empty trail and towering rock faces on either side. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt heavier than before. Marcus pressed the recorder closer to his mouth. "This is Marcus Rivera, 10:47 a.m. I'm experiencing what appears to be some kind of audio hallucination, possibly caused by ... He paused, struggling to maintain his skeptical tone. Possibly caused by the canyon's unique acoustic properties. As he continued recording his observations, a new sound reached his ears. The distant laughter of children, clear and unmistakable. It seemed to come from somewhere ahead on the trail. Marcus quickened his pace, following the sound around a bend in the path. The laughter grew louder, more distinct. Happy, playful voices that contrasted sharply with the canyon's ominous reputation. Rounding a large boulder, Marcus stopped in his tracks. Before him stood a group of children, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, playing some kind of game in a small clearing. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, simple dresses and suspenders that looked like they belonged to another era. Their faces were pale, almost translucent in the filtered sunlight. Marcus raised his recorder, his journalistic instincts overriding his shock. But as he stepped forward, one of the children turned toward him, a girl with dark hair and hollow eyes. She stared directly at him, her expression shifting from playfulness to something far more sinister. The other children stopped playing and turned as well. Their laughter died away, replaced by an expectant silence that made Marcus's skin crawl. He tried to speak, to ask who they were and what they were doing there, but no words came out. The girl smiled a smile that seemed too wide to knowing for a child. Then, one by one, the children began to fade like morning mist, becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. Within seconds, the clearing was empty, except for Marcus, who stood frozen in place, his recorder still running. The silence that followed was broken only by the sudden appearance of a strong, sulfurous smell like burning matches or rotten eggs. Marcus covered his nose, his heart pounding as he backed away from the spot where the children had been. His rational mind struggled to process what he'd witnessed, but the evidence was undeniable. His recorder had captured everything, as if the canyon had decided to offer one final demonstration of its mysteries. Marcus caught movement from the corner of his eye. On a rocky outcropping above the trail, a tall figure in a dark hood stood motionless, silhouetted against the sky. The figure seemed to float rather than stand, defying the laws of physics as Marcus watched in growing terror. Then Marcus blinked. When his eyes opened again, the figure was gone, but the sulfur smell remained, stronger than ever, and his recorder continued to capture the impossible evidence of what he'd witnessed. Shaken to his core, Marcus turned and fled up the trail, his scientific skepticism replaced by a profound respect for the unknown. Some stories, he realized, weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to remind humanity that the world still held mysteries beyond understanding. The canyon had shared its secrets with him, and Marcus knew he would never be the same. The Mirror's Whisper. The Roosevelt Hotel stood like a forgotten monument to a bygone era in downtown Fresno, its once grand facade now weathered by decades of neglect and whispered rumors. Sarah had always been skeptical of ghost stories, which made her choice to investigate the hotel's paranormal activity all the more ironic. As a journalist, researching unexplained phenomena for her next article, she'd heard the tales about room 212 stories that made even the bravest guests flee in terror. The elderly night clerk, Mr. Hendricks, handed her the key with trembling fingers. "Room 212, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Third floor, end of the hall. Please. ... Be careful." Sarah laughed it off as she climbed the creaking staircase, her footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. The hotel's faded grandeur was evident in the ornate wallpaper and brass fixtures, but an oppressive atmosphere seemed to cling to every surface. She found room 212 exactly where Hendricks had described it, ominous and foreboding, as if the door itself was warning her to turn back. The room was surprisingly well preserved, with antique furniture and a large, ornate mirror hanging above the dresser. The mirror's surface was pristine, reflecting the single lamp she'd plugged in with almost supernatural clarity. Sarah set up her recording equipment, determined to spend the night documenting whatever phenomena might occur. The first few hours passed uneventfully. She wrote in her notebook and occasionally checked her equipment. Around midnight, the temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. Her breath became visible in small puffs, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. It was then that she first felt a subtle shift in the air, like someone had entered the room behind her. Sarah turned slowly, expecting to see another guest, or perhaps the night clerk, but the room was empty. Yet the feeling of being watched was unmistakable, growing stronger with each passing moment. The mirror began to behave strangely in its reflection. Sarah could see herself clearly, but there seemed to be movement in the corners of the glass that didn't correspond to anything in the actual room. She approached the mirror cautiously, studying her own reflection while trying to catch glimpses of what might be causing the disturbance. That's when she saw it not in the mirror, but behind her in the actual room, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond her peripheral vision. When she spun around, Nothing was there, but the mirror now showed two figures, herself and something else standing behind her chair. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the entity was learning to manipulate the mirror's reflection. The figure in the glass began to move independently, raising its arms slowly. She could feel cold hands beginning to encircle her throat, just as the previous guests had described. The pressure was real and growing stronger. Panic set in as she struggled to breathe, clawing at the invisible hands. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and she could see faces, dozens of them appearing and disappearing in its depths. They were all former guests, trapped somehow within the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. The whisper came suddenly, soft and intimate, as if someone were speaking directly into her ear. It said her name, Sarah, with such familiarity that she nearly believed it was her own voice. But then it spoke again, this time saying Sarah and help simultaneously, the words overlapping in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The entity was learning, growing stronger with each encounter. It had been feeding on the fear of countless guests, and Sarah's presence only made it more powerful. The hands around her throat tightened, and she could feel herself being pulled toward the mirror, toward whatever dimension or realm existed behind its glass surface. In desperation, she grabbed a heavy lamp and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like breaking bones, and immediately the pressure around her throat vanished. The room filled with a wailing sound, part human, part something else entirely, before fading into an unnatural silence. Sarah fled the room, then the hotel, not stopping until she was safely outside in the cool night air. Behind her, the Roosevelt Hotel loomed in darkness, its secret still hidden within its walls. Room 212 would wait for its next guest, its mirror slowly reforming, its malevolent presence growing stronger with each encounter. She never wrote that article. Some stories, she realized, were better left untold. The weight of stone, the Colorado Street Bridge, stretched across the Arroyo Seco like a concrete prayer, its Art Deco arches catching the last light of evening. To Maya Chun, it had always been just another way home, from a night shift at the hospital till the night it revealed its secrets. She was hurrying across, keys clutched tight, when she first noticed the figure. A woman in a white dress stood at the railing near the Pasadena side, staring down into the darkness below. Something about her posture, the rigid angle of her shoulders, the way her head tilted, unnaturally made Maya's skin crawl. "Excuse me," Maya called out, her voice echoing off the bridge's stone face. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't turn. Maya approached carefully, her nurse's training kicking in. But as she drew closer, the figure seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement. One moment she was there, and the next gone. Maya stopped dead, heart hammering. She looked around wildly, but the bridge was empty, except for her own reflection in the dark glass of a passing car. Shaking her head, she told herself she was just tired, seeing things in the shadows. But the bridge had other plans. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself crossing it at all hours, sometimes deliberately, drawn by something she couldn't name. She wasn't the only one who noticed strange things. Her co-worker, Jake, mentioned seeing a man in old-fashioned clothes near the center arch, walking in place like a forgotten film reel. A Jagashima complained about sudden drops in temperature that made her breath visible in the California warmth. The stories multiplied like urban legends do, but these felt different to Maya. They carried weight, detail, the ring of truth from people who had no reason to fabricate such things. She began researching the bridge's history, uncovering a grim tally, over a century of deaths, each one adding to the structure's haunted reputation. The local homeless population spoke in hushed tones about the watchers, spirits who paced the bridge's length, sometimes helpful, sometimes malevolent. One October night, Maya's investigation took a terrifying turn. She was walking near the bridge's midpoint when icy fingers wrapped around her wrist with crushing force. She spun around, expecting to face an attacker, but found only empty air. The grip tightened, pulling her toward the railing. "Help!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. The invisible hands pushed harder, and Maya felt her feet leave the ground. In that moment of suspended terror, She saw them, dozens of translucent figures materializing around her, their faces twisted in anguish, all pushing, all falling, all desperate to take someone with them. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pressure vanished. Maya collapsed onto the bridge deck, gasping and shaking. The figures faded like morning mist, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She never walked the bridge alone again. Maya shared her experience with others, who claimed to have encountered the bridge's restless spirits. They formed an unlikely community of survivors, bound by their brushes with the supernatural. Some were skeptics, who had been converted by personal experience. Others were believers seeking validation. Together, they learned to recognize the signs, the way shadows moved against the light, how the temperature dropped in specific spots, the feeling of being watched by eyes that had long since closed. They developed rituals, walking in groups, carrying small mirrors to reflect unwanted attention, speaking aloud to announce their presence to any lingering spirits. The bridge continued its grim work, claiming new victims, while the survivors watched helplessly from the sidelines. Maya volunteered with local mental health organizations, hoping to prevent tragedies before they occurred. She knew the bridge would never be truly safe. Some places carried the weight of too much sorrow to ever be cleansed. On clear nights, when the moonlight struck the Colorado Street Bridge just right, Maya could still see them. The watchers, the fallen, the lost souls who had never quite let go of the world they'd left behind. They paced the bridge's length in eternal repetition, trapped between life and death, seeking something they could never find. The bridge stood as beautiful as ever, its graceful arches, a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. But those who knew its true nature understood the costs of that beauty, the countless stories of despair that had become woven into its very foundations. Maya had learned that some places were more than locations. They were repositories of human experience, both joyful and terrible. The Colorado Street Bridge held all of it, suspended in concrete and steel, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to walk its haunted span. She still crossed it sometimes, but never alone, never at night, and never without remembering the weight of invisible hands and the cold touch of eternity. The Chinese cemetery ca. The gravel crunched beneath Sarah Chun's boots as she stepped through the rusted iron gates, her flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The Chinese cemetery in Locke, California, sprawled before her like a forgotten city of the dead, its weathered headstones tilting at drunken angles beneath centuries of neglect. She'd heard the stories everyone in town had, but as a journalist researching forgotten histories, she couldn't resist investigating the truth behind the local legends. The cemetery was enormous, containing thousands of graves, dating back to the 1850s gold rush era. Chinese laborers, railroad builders, and merchants had been buried here, their families often unable to afford proper headstones or maintain their final resting places. Nature had claimed the grounds with wild, abandoned thick vines choked marble tablets, tree roots, cracked concrete pathways, and morning glory flowers bloomed defiantly over sunken earth. Sarah's research had revealed that the cemetery's neglect wasn't just due to time and weather. In the early 1900s, anti-Chinese sentiment had been so strong that families were often prevented from properly caring for their ancestors' graves. Many plots had been sold off or simply abandoned, leaving the dead to fade into obscurity alongside their living descendants. As dawn broke, Sarah began documenting the headstones, photographing inscriptions that told stories of lives lived in hardship and hope. Here lies Huang Lum, died 1874, age 32. Read one weathered marker, another simply bore Chinese characters, their meaning lost to time and poor preservation. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the temperature drop until her breath began forming visible clouds in the morning air. Strange, California rarely got this cold, even in winter. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and continued her survey. But something felt different now. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against her ears. That's when she heard a low, keening wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the gravestones, but saw nothing. The sound came again, more distinct this time, unmistakably human in its anguish. It was the cry of someone in tremendous pain, echoing from beneath the cracked soil. Her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that she was alone, but her body responded with primal fear. Sarah found herself backing toward the cemetery gates, her equipment forgotten, when her foot caught on something. She stumbled, her flashlight spinning away and illuminating a sight that made her blood freeze. A red lantern hung suspended in midair, about 10 feet from the nearest grave, its silk panels glowing with an impossible inner fire. No flame flickered within, just a steady, supernatural crimson light that pulsed like a heartbeat. As she watched in terror, 2 more lanterns materialized nearby, their eerie glow painting the neglected cemetery in hellish red. Sarah's retreat became a scramble. She grabbed her equipment and bolted for the gates, but the cemetery seemed to have grown larger, the distance to freedom stretching impossibly far. Behind her, the wailing intensified, joined by other sounds, scratching, clawing, as if something were trying to claw its way up from the disturbed earth. She could feel eyes on her, countless eyes watching from below, tracking her movement with hungry attention. The sensation was so overwhelming that Sarah risked a glance over her shoulder, immediately regretting the decision. Dozens of pale faces had emerged from the cracked earth, their mouths open in eternal screams, eyes black as the soil that had claimed them. These weren't the faces of the recently dead. They were ancient, bearing the weathered features of men and women who had lived and died in another century, their spirits trapped between worlds by neglect and injustice. They reached toward her with skeletal hands, not in malice, but in desperate need. They wanted to be remembered, to have their stories told, to finally rest in peace with the dignity they'd been denied in death. Sarah burst through the cemetery gates and didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. As she drove away, she caught one last glimpse in her rearview mirror, the red lanterns still glowing in the growing daylight, and the impression of countless eyes watching her departure from beneath the earth. Later, researching the cemetery's history, Sarah discovered that she wasn't the first to experience such phenomena. A paranormal investigation team had entered the grounds months earlier, armed with sophisticated equipment and professional skepticism. They barely lasted an hour before one member collapsed in convulsions, babbling about being watched from underground. The team had fled, refusing to return despite their initial bravado. But Sarah understood now that what she'd encountered wasn't malevolent. These weren't monsters lurking in the dark, but souls crying out for acknowledgement. Their unfinished business rooted not in evil, but in the fundamental human need to matter, to be remembered, to have one's existence validated. The Chinese cemetery held more than Beaudesert, held the accumulated grief of thousands who had built railroads, worked gold mines, and contributed to California's growth, only to be forgotten in death. As they had been marginalized in life, their spirits weren't trying to harm anyone. They were reaching out across the decades, asking simply to be seen, to have their stories preserved before they faded forever into the silence of the forgotten. Sarah never returned to the cemetery, but she kept her promise to those restless souls. Her article about the Chinese cemetery in Locke became a passionate plea for historical preservation, sparking community efforts to restore the neglected burial ground, because some stories are too important to remain buried. Even when they're told from beyond the grave, California is a land of beauty and mystery. But peel back the curtain of sunshine, and you'll find darkness that never sleeps. These haunted places are more than just stories. They're warnings, whispers, invitations. So the next time you walk down a quiet hall or hear a creak behind you, ask yourself, is it just the wind or something watching? Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the 15 most haunted places in California. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more terrifying tales. And remember, the shadows in California are longer than they appear.